I've got something really special to present to you today that I've been obsessively reading over the past week or so since I received it from the publisher. These are 2 issues of Knock Zine, an old school gaming bric-a-brac as it's described on the spine, and on the front cover it's described as an adventure gaming bric-a-brac, and indeed in issue number 1 there is a short piece by Ben Milton talking about the use of the term adventure gaming for what one does in the OSR RPG area. These are a compendium of miscellanea for use with old school role-playing games. And it is a compendium and it is miscellanea. It is incredibly rich. It is a collection of pieces from around the blogosphere written by these contributors, which I'm not going to go through the various names of them. If you are somebody who reads a lot of blogs in the RPG space, you'll recognize some of these names. I am somebody who attempts to read blogs, but frankly, they are, as blogs would be, all over the place, and I don't know about a lot of them. And for that reason alone, this was very, very useful to me, because not only is the content high quality and a combination of material you could throw into a game, but also articles on bigger picture topics like what I want in an OSR game, for example, or the piece that I referenced by Ben Milton, that it's all together here and it's been curated. And these are the credits here, that who is the publisher of Knock, and the first issue was dated January 2021. The second issue here is dated June 2021. We are going to look through both issues, and it's absolutely impossible for me to totally do a page through because there's just so much content, and I really have been devouring it, and I am going to, I'm certain, pick this up and use this in some upcoming sessions. It says the classes and monsters in this issue use formatting borrowed from Old School Essentials. I just did a video on Old School Essentials. You can see the link to that here. And there are, in the back of both of the issues, there are some, specifically just some new monsters that can be used, or even new PC types for you to use. That is not overall what is in this. This is not just add-on material for Old School Essentials, but it is keyed toward that. Just starting from the wraparound, you can see that there's an entire adventure here for first and second level characters, and this is incredible. The level of detail just to play this one piece that's the wraparound is a ton of gameplay. And it is incredibly clever use of space, as you'll see throughout this. There's a high level of design, as you would expect for a piece like this. You've got your 2d6 reaction table here on the spine, and everything is very effectively used in terms of the color, the font, the columns. Though there's a lot in here, it is very easy to read. And again, throughout, there's no point in my continuing to say that the whole thing is just excellently and very creatively designed. On the back here, we have a Meet the Demon, where you can you meet this demon and use his body for functionality. He's got D8 uses for his harvested eye, D8 magical powers, motivations, and gaze attacks. And I think, and then here, what is its true name? You can roll and then you consult the spine of the actual book to come up with his name. Again, just incredibly clever, and I'm going to try to avoid saying clever again in this video. So the editor says at the beginning, Dungeons & Dragons is everywhere these days, but never far behind. Skulking in the dragon's shadow is an army of creative, crazy rebels. We come from all walks of nerd life, etc., and this is defining the OSR. You can call us OSR, Sword Dream, Adventure Gamers, or just those weirdos. You decide, because you're one of us now. And that explains the motivation here, wanting to bring a snapshot of the gaming culture bound into a book like this. And some of the material, it says, you may have read before, collected in this dense volume for posterity and for prep sessions. It is incredibly dense in the best of ways. There's a lot that's packed in here. You can just sort of see it in the table of contents here. And we will flip through some of the pieces that, just to show you the breadth of this. So it begins with a large scale overview, what I want in an OSR game. And I think the term OSR is used in many different ways, as you probably know, both to describe certain types of game systems, but then also like a gaming approach. And I think for a variety of reasons, OSR is an approach and a series of systems that are very conducive to solo play and useful for the soloist, and like a lower barrier of entry in a lot of ways. And philosophically, the approach, I think, works for solo play, and maybe that's the subject of a future video. I don't know. Some of this I'm just going to be flipping through, and you can pause the video to see what is here. Wizard weaknesses, for example. Here is a D66 table of wizard weaknesses if you wanted to just roll on that. Say a D66 table on starting gear. So for example, smelly troll leather armor. It regenerates 1 HP every 1d6 hours. Just the little things to give some flavor. This I really like. The village's local retired adventure. You can roll on that and just get a quick NPC or a flavor for something. I found that reading through this it made me just think about what I might want to put into another session. And there was just so much here. I didn't want to put post-it notes on it, but I had to stop myself from putting post-it notes on it because I wanted to use this and I wanted to use that. Dungeon checklist. And this was great because it conceptualizes the dungeons in a large scale manner, and that I think when, especially doing solo, it can be challenging to step back and think about this. We want something to steal. We want something to be killed, something to kill you, different paths, someone to talk to. And there's a discussion of all of these points here. Giving your wandering monsters some type of purpose rather than just wandering around. This is an interesting piece on hit dice and what they can, different ways that you can use them and mitigate them, or have a sense, well, I would call it a narrative way of taking wounds and becoming weaker. And this is an interesting, it's something to think about in terms of enriching a gameplay session, and not just counting down wounds, but really thinking about what that could mean, the implications of it. This is the piece I mentioned at the beginning by Ben Milton, Naming My Game. He says, here's a bit of an epiphany I had. If I had to sum up the kinds of games I like to play in a single term, the term I'd like best wouldn't be old school Renaissance or Dungeons and Dragons or DIY RPG or even role-playing games, but adventure games. And he talks about the reason why. This is an interesting piece on somebody who says, I was a Pathfinder guy who got inspired by blogs and then spent some time trying to figure out what OSR was. And he analyzes the flexibility, I would call it, of OSR style gameplay. And some of these points, again, they make OSR very conducive for the soloist. And as I said, maybe I'll get into that in a future video. It's a sort of theoretical point, but for the soloist, it's an interesting concept to think about. My goblins there's a very lengthy piece here on giving your goblins some things and making them a little magical and what they're wearing, and just kind of building them out fleshing them out, as it were. We have a new monster reaction table here of things that they actually might want and the implications of them. So they might want a random item or food or gold. This piece spoke to me by Emmy Allen. RPGs as emotional gambling. When you make a player character, you're investing a little bit of creativity into them and the emotional connection that you would have to the character and some ways to enact that during gameplay. The book came with a card that is describing a special type of grimoire that's made out of marble and ways to create an on-the-fly spell that you could indicate based on the words what it might do. What I thought was really cool about this was the concept that to gauge the power of the spell, you count the capitalized words in its name. It lasts this amount of days, hours, turns, or rounds, and that is that's really cool. It does this number of d6s worth of damage. A creature summoned has this many hit dice, etc. I've never seen anyone do that concept before, and I think that's very clever. I think I said clever again, and I said I wasn't going to. All right, a 1d6 thieving. This is a simple system to handle rogue skill training so that each rogue can customize their abilities. So again, you could see that there's a real mixture in the pieces of just sort of a straight up type of article, some new rules that can be put into an aspect of your game or character, or some tables. So here are 8 statue encounters. You can roll a d8 and just get some statue information. And so as an aside for me, like I could see just starting an entire session, just rolling on something here. It's going to give you a setting. This is in a library, a cave in the wilderness. It's going to give you some information, and then starting to ask questions about why this is, and maybe your character is related to the statue in some way. In what way is your character related to the statue? Could build out a whole story just from something like this. More articles about dungeon life and dungeon creation, different approaches to creating a dungeon and what they mean and the implications of that. An interesting piece on how to have actual impact in a game and what that might mean. If you just have random combat and it doesn't really impact the game in a way, impact is the ability to permanently change the game. The opposite of impact is fluff. And it says impact correlates with how your players care. So if no one's invested in the outcome of the encounter, it's hard to make it fun. And I think that that's something, again, also to think about when, as for the soloists here, that sometimes one can fall into the trap of just creating another encounter, another combat, without really thinking about what it might mean in the evolving story. And that is where then you just are playing out the mechanics of a rule set and maybe less interesting. Or one of the key pieces of advice here relates to other parts of the map, meaning that the random encounter doesn't mean unconnected encounters. Maybe the really well-dressed orc is the chieftain's son and asked to be ransomed back when he surrenders, etc. So that random encounters need to be connected to things outside of themselves, and doing that will help create or knit the narrative fabric even tighter, I think, is the message there. A D20 table of magic helmets. Helmets are cool. Helmets are fun. Helmets are a good way to distinguish your full plate wearing warrior from the rabble. There's a cute illustration here of a very elaborate helmet and a D20 somewhat humorous table. Here's a salad helm with sweeping red light through the eye slit. Mighty impressive. This one's shaped like a cat's head, so it gives you some aerobic, acrobatic ability, +4 to ability checks and saves, and your alignment switches to chaotic. That's pretty humorous if you have a cat, or even if you don't, you probably get that joke. Here's a lengthy piece on module design and different ways of designing and approaching modules. And again, from the perspective of the soloist, this is interesting to think about in terms of what you're explicitly doing when you're putting together your session and giving you perhaps a framework or way of thinking about something in the bigger picture as opposed to just sitting down and having it play out. And again, that dance between being the player, having things naturally arise, and planning things out, or having somewhat of a conscious structure to the session or to the campaign is part of soloing, and it can be a stumbling block or it can enrich your sessions. And that article was very good about thinking in the bigger picture. In brief piece on different ways to enliven the corridors in a dungeon and what that might mean. 34 good traps. A room dusted with powder. Any rapid movement disturbs the powder, sending it into the air and then the lungs of anybody breathing nearby. A hidden pressure plate in the center of the room triggers a loud siren, alerting any nearby threats. This is an analysis of the famous Into the Borderlands module and speculation about where the Borderlands actually was, and trying to put some reality to what the Borderlands might have been in the real world, talking about the archaeology of the keep of the Borderlands, and then by the same person or connected to that, a variation on the Caves of Chaos that was connected with that. Here's a piece, I Eat the Body. The I Search the Body random table is a staple of fantasy games, but a weird fantasy game needs something more, something else. Each part of a dead creature's body has different effects on the adventurer turned cannibal, and these are thematic, so the heart is, the heart's going to give you something different than the arms or the legs, and those are all going to be related to that part of the body. It's a little gruesome, but it's pretty cool. So eyes are tasty. They keep secret knowledge. They know stories. They have seen it all. What do you see? Roll 1d4 to find out. This is a very detailed dungeon in the sewers of mystery, and the material here is just phenomenal, and this gave me the thought that I would start some session here in these sewers. You have the tunnel size, the depth of the water, you have weird secret rooms, adjoining structures, different encounters. Again, you can see just from the layout here, these are D66 tables. They're going to be more prompts than anything else. So it is a recipe to create your own story out of that, and forcing you to have narrative linkages, because we're not given a whole bunch of stats. There's not a whole bunch of explanation here. Complete the dungeon worksheet with some die rolling to get you going with a title and a factions that are in your dungeon and their nature, their aspect, their goals, their secrets. And we have complete the encounter. This is an encounter with this Cyclops, the green Cyclops R, and you are meant to fill this in. This is one of the few that this looks like a space thing. There's very few things in here that would be considered, I think, for science fiction. I suppose I should have said that up front. Just Use Bears is a very short piece on how to make a stat for a monster that you might be creating, and the default being just go to the bear stats and then build out your own monster with your whatever you want to put in it, or whatever special attacks you want to give or special abilities, but the stats themselves could come from a bear stat. As we near the end of the book, we are presented with a number of different dungeons that people have drawn in various states of development, and you have at the end of this section here a key and a discussion by the artists of what they were thinking when they drew them, a little bit about the history of their own relationship to artistry, and in particular to RPG artistry. I think they're probably too small to actually use, and you don't have all the keys, but the presentation of basically an artist statement along with the dungeon is great, and the recognition that there is in RPGing and OSR in particular such talent and really such visual artistry that it deserves its own place just as an artistic medium and as an artistic contribution, and that's what is here. Then we move to these are the ones that are keyed to old school essentials. We move to this is called a Retinue of Rogues, and we have a living harness, a ne'er-do-well, with all the stats. These are again specifically from Old School Essentials, but you could modify them to work with whatever set you were using, whatever rules you were using. The Naked Wanderer, a sheep, a hamstero. I like this guy here. He's a small 3-foot tall humanoid, fairly robust with small legs and arms and a pudgy figure due to their thick, puffy fur. They're often mistaken for being extremely shy, but most of them are merely restrained and modest. They make loyal companions to those who treat them with respect. They have constant activity. They have a hard time staying still and focused. They tend to want to hop about, run on all fours. The referee should feel free to apply penalties to reaction rolls, ability checks, and the like when this constant activity may prove problematic. We have a Swarmlord. It says this class is a more generic version of the Goblin Enchantress, and it is, I really, really like this character and was thinking that I might do something with this because the Swarmlord surrounds herself with a mob of eager and utterly loyal vermin, or indeed any kind of small creature such as birds, insects, etc., and she controls them. The strength of the swarm is represented by a swarm die, and it begins at D6 and improves as she levels up. And I read this and thought I would like to do something with this as my character because it's a way of having a main character and then the swarm is like these sub characters, but you don't have to fully develop them out. This I thought was also fantastic. D66 former occupations table. So you have your character and it says you roll a d66 to define the former occupation, but then you're rolling a d6 and you're either getting the pleasant side of that former occupation, the not so pleasant side, or both. So this is a fantastic concept for a table where you're not just having the entries, but it's more variegated. It could be a good thing or a bad thing. So perhaps you had been a pilgrim in the past. The good part is you always get to pay half price at the inn. However, the bad price is you have a -1 to wisdom until you've prayed in 77 different temples. Again, you would have to modify that to fit your particular story, but the concept of a backstory is great, but the concept of this risk about whether or not it's going to be positive or negative or both is cool. We have a menagerie of monstrosities here, and they are Thurible the cat, again with 2 OSE. We have an Ambler here. That's a contraction of the words armored and shambler. Is an elemental creature created from the massive sphere of armor and weapons that are lying around in the sort of demi-plane. Great concept. A mossling. Mossies are undead creatures born from the rotting corpses and lamenting souls of people who died alone after getting lost in the heart of an ancient forest. The mole folk, I like this guy quite a bit. A moon siren. A Trode. This immortal being was born of the unholy union of a troll and a giant toad. So, cool. It's cool. Gives you that kind of sums up, I think, a lot of the feel of what one might say OSR is. We have a treasure frog with different types of amounts of treasure that he might have depending on how big he is. And then toward the end, we have a bunch of playable modules that are quite detailed. The Citadel of Evil here, sort of a nod back to with the coloration and the font a nod back to the very early versions of D&D. Praise the Fallen, this is a very detailed OSR module. This is levels 2 to 4, and this is levels 1 to 3. What's great about this one is we have the overall map, but then within each section of the map, it's extremely detailed. And there's actually a lot of information in here that I think would make it a very good foundation or basis for a story for a soloist. You would need to put in the stats here. It's telling you overall generalities about the stats, but not the specific, not all the specific stats. So for example, the AC, you would have to figure out what that would be. So there'd be a little work you would need to do on that end. But as you can see, quite lengthy. And then at the end, there's one more brief one, the Wizard Cave. And we have what is the wizard up to? Who are his guests? The missions, the followers, treasures for trade. There's visiting beasts. Again, just with this very, very, very few pages, kind of epitomizes the richness of the material in here. It's just, there's a lot packed into this volume. And for me, the mixture of the practical tables and things that you can just roll on and either within a session or to start a session, like even this wizard's cave, just rolling this up is the beginning of a story, and somehow coming from this to create, maybe the wizard is the one who's sending you on your mission. Maybe you're returning to this cave in some manner. That is a story seed, and there's so many of those in here. But combined with the inclusion of a significant portion of essays about the theorizing about what it means to play OSR, what it means to create a module, a session, a dungeon from a bigger picture perspective. Those two things together, I think, make this incredibly valuable. So I had said at the beginning of the video that I was going to do one video on knock number 1 and knock number 2, but I decided as I was going through this that I'm going to have 2 separate videos because there's just too much to discuss. But as we conclude, I just want to point something out about the 2 of them, that on the back of the wraparound of Volume 1 and Volume 2, wraparound Volume 1 has a quote from Gary Gygax: "The worthy GM never purposefully kills players' PCs. He presents opportunities for the rash and unthinking players to do that all on their own." It's a humorous quote and thought-provoking. And Volume 2 has a quote from Dave Arneson about what Blackmore was made up of, and a lot of it was input from the players and the way they were seeing the world and what they were doing in it. I just kept notes. I built the framework and would occasionally throw in a few storylines, but it was the players getting involved in filling in a lot of the gaps that made a difference. And I conclude with this quote from Knock 2, even though we're not looking through this in this video, because I think in a lot of ways that concept sums up some of the reasons why the OSR approach meshes so well with some of the philosophy of a soloist. Because again, by definition, if you're doing some solo RPGing, you have to be both the player and the GM at the same time. Sometimes you're more one than the other, but you're always really both. And this Arneson quote is talking about the ways in which, very consciously, as the DM, he was creating a situation that player action and player contribution was going to develop. And that philosophy and that fact, that approach, is what soloists end up having to do. So that is a look inside knock number 1. It is, as I said at the outset of the video, I think of right now, at least, of all the supplements, compendiums, materials that I have seen, that I've been sent, this is in one place just the richest and a very unique combination of articles and bigger picture meta discussion with a bunch of random tables, a bunch of modules. You've got some characters you can play, you have some enemies you can fight, and super, super rich in that regard for all sorts of things. Really, really impressive. And as I said also at the outset, for me, I make an attempt to look at blogs, to find out about them, to look at lists of blogs, but it's like an overwhelming, I mean, in a good way, it's overwhelming, but it's just overwhelming for me, and I find that I just don't have the time to spend doing that. And this is a curation of some of the best writing and creativity that's out there in the OSR world.